Hi there. So this evening I put the kids to bed. I did some work on Infobit and then logged on to Quora, where I often debate atheists about the meaning of atheism. For some reason, I find this fun. One thing led to another, and now it's just after midnight, and I'm making a video about how to be an atheist. I myself became a non-believer when I was a teenager, and I've thought quite a lot about questions in philosophy of religion since then. I've taught the subject a couple of times at Ohio State and maintain a personal interest in basic philosophical questions about religion. The outcome of these ruminations is that I am still 20 years later, not a believer. I have no belief whatsoever that I'm aware of in any sort of higher power. But I am not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. To be an atheist is to take a position. To be an atheist is to take a stance. And I don't take a stance on the existence of God or about anything that I would call a God. I take no position, and this is why I call myself an agnostic and why most people would have no trouble calling me an agnostic, and why they'd find it actually weird, if not just wrong, to call me an atheist. Nevertheless, according to the usage of many atheist activists online, or new atheists if you prefer, I am an atheist. But again, I insist that I'm not. So I'm not going to rehearse all the arguments pro and con on whether the mere lack of belief in the divine is sufficient for being an atheist. I've done that quite a bit on Quora, and I'm not eager to rehash all that here. It would probably be boring for most people. But I thought I would offer a little unsolicited advice on the topic of how to be an atheist. So here goes. Vocal online atheists seem to be very concerned, rather too much concerned, about having a burden of proof. If anyone suggests that they do have a burden to prove that God does not exist, they get very bothered for some reason, and they deny taking the position that God doesn't exist. They assert rather only that they don't believe that God does exist. And the lack of a claim does not carry with it any burden of proof. And that's right, as far as it goes. The problem is that if you ask these online atheist activists, does God not exist, then you rarely get a clear answer, which I find suggestive. So, let me suggest a few tactics for them. Here then is tactic number 1. Say it. Stop being so tiresome and just say it. In the future, my atheist friends, I recommend that you be quite clear and say you believe that God doesn't exist, or that no gods exist, and that you find the very idea ridiculous. That is the position, it seems to me, you probably do take. After all, the sorts of arguments you make against theism are so completely disdainful and dismissive that you've made it very, very clear just how ridiculous you find belief in God to be. A person does not disdainfully, dismissively ridicule a belief that he believes might be correct, right? But let me hasten to add tactic number 2. To avoid the burden of proof that you so fear, simply say that you believe no gods exist or that they're highly unlikely. One of the beginner mistakes that people make in philosophy, and therefore in discussions about atheism, is that if you make a claim or state that you believe something, that entails somehow that you know it is true. People under this misapprehension, and it is a misapprehension, they think that if an atheist says, I believe God doesn't exist, or I think it's almost certain that no gods exist, then it's somehow a devastating repartee to say, but how can you possibly know that? The response is to patiently point out that saying that you believe something doesn't entail a claim that you know it. You can admit that you don't know it. There are many things that are very well established in science and history, geography, and so forth that probably don't rise to the level of knowledge according to any strict canons of knowledge. And yet probably you rationally believe them. Still, a theist might press you, the atheist, and say, if you, atheist, claim that God doesn't exist, but you don't know that, then you're being irrational. You're relying on faith just as much as I am. But once again, this is another beginner mistake, and not the zinger that some people seem to think it is. So there's no reason to be afraid of this point. You just have to bear in mind tactic number 3. There are arguments for the non-existence of God. Own up to this handy fact and use them. There might not be arguments for the non-existence of all gods, but there are at least 3 well-known arguments against the existence of the traditional Judeo-Christian God, which is, after all, probably the only God your theistic opponent cares about. These are not mathematically rigorous arguments. They aren't proofs. But remember, you aren't claiming to know that God doesn't exist. That's not your point. That's not your position. Proofs aren't necessary. You're simply saying that it is your position, that you have some arguments for your position. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Nothing. That's your attitude toward any number of scientific theories, right? And you don't worry that you'll be accused of accepting science irrationally, do you? Anyway, I'm not going to go over the arguments in any detail. I'll just point you in their direction. You've all heard these arguments before in any case, or if you haven't, you really don't have any business calling yourself an atheist, frankly. So the most famous, perhaps, is the problem of evil, which in its argumentative form says that God can't exist because there is no way that a perfectly good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God could allow evil to be inflicted on innocents in the world. Any God that created the mess we live in would have to be deficient, either in power or knowledge or goodness. Take your pick. And then we're not talking about the Judeo-Christian God anymore. Second is the argument from Parsimony, or Occam's razor. This says that the concept of God simply doesn't do any explanatory work in a mature science. Occam's razor, also called the principle of parsimony, is then called upon. And it says that if an entity is not necessary in any scientific explanation, that constitutes an excellent reason to think it doesn't exist. Again, this is not meant to be a proof of a knowledge claim, but merely an argument for a quite reasonable belief. A third, perhaps lesser-known argument is that we have no experience whatsoever with the notion of a mind or soul, whatever God might be, that can simply bring things into existence with a thought. This is a Humean argument. Lacking any sort of experience of minds creating stuff out of nothing, we have no notion of what it even means to say that a mind or a soul or a spirit or whatever God is supposed to be created anything. And then from here, you can either argue that talk of God is nonsense, which admittedly doesn't quite support atheism per se, or you can argue, again, that parsimony requires us to toss out anything that does no explanatory work. So, if you don't think that any of these arguments, individually or together, are adequate to support the view that God doesn't exist, then, this is hard to say, but then you probably shouldn't be calling yourself an atheist after all, but instead simply an agnostic, like me. Maybe, you have some other argument to support your atheism, and if so, grand, but if not, then yeah, I'd have to agree with your theistic critics that your brand of atheism is not quite rational. Still, there have been lots of atheists throughout history who have relied on arguments like this, like the ones that I gave, to support their atheism. So I commend them to you. And so there you have it. How to be an atheist without relying on the weak strategy of insisting that you don't really believe God doesn't exist. Yes, atheists, yes, you really do believe God doesn't exist, and that's perfectly okay. And it shouldn't make you nervous. If you still want to maintain that you don't take a position, then you aren't an atheist. Like me, you're an agnostic. Anyway, well, that's it. Thanks, and be gentle with me in the comments.